I have used co-review a lot in cases where I'm too busy to take on a reviewing assignment, and the area that is covered is something that I'm qualified to review, but I don't have time to do it. But I think it would be helpful for a graduate student, a senior graduate student, or a postdoc to do the review. And so I invite them to do that. And I think the reason that can be useful for me is that I feel bad about turning down requests to review. I do it all the time because I get a lot of them. But I would really prefer to be able to do the review. And also I think it's a wonderful learning opportunity for someone who maybe hasn't had a chance to do a review before.
Yeah, that really jives with my experience as well. My first several reviews were co-reviews with Nancy, and I'm really grateful that we had that option available to us. I think it was really helpful to be able to read a paper and talk about it with Nancy, my co-reviewer, to process what the paper was about. And then also having someone to review my own review was really helpful, because it took some time for me to learn sort of how to focus a review on the main topics that we felt needed to be addressed in the paper, and being able to find the voice and the right balance of constructive criticism and also finding the strengths of the paper was something that took a little time to figure out. And so I'm grateful that I had Nancy there for the process to figure out exactly what that narrative would look like. Generally, what would happen is that Nancy would be prompted to review a paper, and she would then reach out to me and say, I've received this request for a review. I think this paper would be interesting for you. Do you want to do a co-review together? And so when I said yes, we would usually set a time to read a time by which we were going to read the paper, and then we would sit down and talk about it together. Talk about the major points, what were the strengths and what could be improved in the paper. And then generally I would take a stab at writing the review, and I would send that to Nancy, and then she would send me comments on that review, and I would revise it, and usually we'd go from there.
And I think that, in probably the first time that you did this, I gave you some examples, it's appropriate things blacked out of what a review might look like, what might be a helpful way to do a review. With proposal reviews, we do this as a group in our group, but with paper reviews, it's just usually this one-on-one co-reviewing thing. I would also say, as an editor, one of the most frustrating things is to see reviews come back that are sort of wishy-washy about what they think should be the disposition of the paper. And so I very much encourage my students, when we're co-reviewing, to take a stand, decide what you think, is this paper worth publishing? Remember, you don't have to rewrite the paper, but that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, and that was really helpful for me, I think, especially as a graduate student. I'm a trainee in the research field. So I think it took a little coaching for me to be able to find that voice and to really state with a level of confidence, I think this paper should be published, or I think it should be published, but only after these revisions are made, or it shouldn't be published. Mm-hmm. That's something as a trainee is nerve-wracking to make those judgments early on. And so I appreciate Nancy. I remember that in my first few reviews of initially writing up, and she said, okay, let's pull out sort of the main crux of of what needs to happen to this paper in order for it to be publishable. And that was really helpful to get super clear about that upfront. I had done some peer reviewing of other folks' writing in our lab group and in classes, especially grant writing and critique and feedback. And I think what was really different for me in those processes is that oftentimes you had access to the author. And so you could kind of have a conversation with the author about kind of what they were thinking and help partner with them to sort of translate what they were thinking into the written product that they're working on. And I think something that's very challenging about writing peer reviews for publications is that you don't get to have that dialogue necessarily. You just have the written product. That's what you have to go off of. So it's really just asking what needs to happen to this written product in order for it to be publishable in this space. And so I think it was very helpful in that space to have a co-reviewer. So you can't necessarily be in contact with the authors, but having the co-reviewer and somebody else to talk about the paper with and what its major strengths and weaknesses were was really helpful for that process.
I would say another thing is that you get a window into the process of publication that you maybe haven't had yet, or maybe you have submitted your first paper and gotten your first, accept with minor revisions or major revisions or reject or whatever. And you get a little bit more of an experience of what goes on in the process where a paper gets reviewed. In our case, I think I bring a perspective of having been an editor for a number of years and having certain things that I want to see from reviewers that help me to make a decision and also help me to tell the authors what they need to do and to be more direct about it. And so I think that's sort of, one-on-one learning about, hey, you should write this this comment in this way because it will really help the editor to have some material to give back to the author to tell them how to change it. So that's sort of more one-on-one experience, I think, that you wouldn't necessarily get and you not get in a classroom for sure.
Yeah, I think that was important. I think when you and I did our first co-review, I don't think I had a set of feedback yet. And so it was helpful for me to try and understand not only how to give useful information to the editor, but also to the authors of the paper, which I think was something I wasn't familiar with prior to that process.
What I get out of it, as again, a senior person in the field, there may be things, right? Like, for instance, and I hate to admit this, but I'm not that great at reviewing, statistical methods anymore because they've all blown past me in terms of, what kinds of statistical methods that people are using. And so having a co-reviewer who is like right in the trenches with, the newest types of, Bayesian analyses or whatever is great because it helps to do a more thorough review of the paper. So that helps me do a better job, as a reviewer. So I'm going to let Amalia, though, answer the question because I've already answered a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about having familiarity with the particular methods that were used in the paper. Although I do distinctly remember reviewing a paper with you at one point that had this modeling framework, and I had no idea what we were reading, but I remember feeling very overwhelmed at that point in time. How am I supposed to review this when I really don't know? I'm not familiar with the modeling methods. And I remember we just sat down and we talked through it so that we got at least a broad understanding of the conceptual approach that they took. And then we said that in the review. And I remember distinctly you saying it's okay to state what your area of expertise is and to, just let them know what was clear and what maybe wasn't so clear in those methods as a non-expert with those particular methods. I think for me, the biggest thing that I got out of the co-reviewing was, again, learning that how to formulate a narrative that really emphasizes what was done well and what needs to change in the paper in order for it to be publishable. And making that very, very clear up front in the review so that the editor and the authors have a very clear understanding of what they need to do. And that was something that wasn't familiar to me. And the biggest part for me was having someone, especially Nancy being senior in the field, someone to talk over the paper with, and also talk over the review, and really getting that process of sort of honing the message in the review. I think it led to certainly the most careful reviews I've ever done. But I've also gotten more confident over time, and it doesn't necessarily take me as long now to find that narrative. I now have those skills about sort of how to pick out a little bit quicker what the major points and themes of a paper are, and where more clarity is needed.
I think it's really, it's a long been an observation of mine that you get a much more thorough review from early career folks. I mean, they have more time to devote to it, or they really want to do a good job or whatever. And so even when I'm selecting reviewers, I try to find early career people and older, more established folks to review, often expecting that I'm going to get the more thorough review from the early career person. And, so it's helpful for the authors of the paper to get such a thorough review, but they can also sometimes come off as completely, really over the top in terms of being critical of a paper and not being helpful in terms of turning it into something that is publishable. And so I think that the opportunity of co-review is to sort of have the balance of what maybe someone that's seen a lot of papers and someone that has not seen as many in this capacity would actually ultimately do. And that can be helpful for both the reviewer, future reviewer, as well as for the authors when they get the paper back.
I think there's potentially a really big benefit if you have the opportunity to write a review and then get feedback on that review from someone, especially someone who's quite senior in the field, who has editorial experience, really going to hone that message in a pretty clear and concise way so that, again, the authors and the editors know what needs to change in order for this to be publication ready.
For me, it's always, the challenge is always, I don't have time to do this, I mean, that's sort of the reason why I initially sort of think about doing a co-review. And, despite the fact that I have a lot of years of experience of reviewing, it still takes me a long time to review a paper. And so co-reviewing it takes some of the load off of that. So for example, I don't write the draft of the review, but I still have to read the paper, and I still have to sort of think through what are the issues associated with it. And so, and for me, it's just something that takes a long time. So I suppose the negative there is that the alternative, if I don't have time to do a full review of something, is that I wouldn't do it at all. And I would just send it back to the editor and say, sorry, don't have time to review it. Yeah, so that's a benefit or a detriment, depending on how you look at it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that was my experience also. That reviewing, when I first started, it took me a really long time. I think I had to read the paper 3 times to feel really confident that I had absorbed all the components of it. And then it took a long time to write up a draft. But I think that those are skills that I would have to learn sooner or later. Obviously, Nancy is quite busy and her schedule is pretty jam-packed, as we learned in scheduling this interview. And that was the case when I was first doing this with her a few years ago. So finding time for us to get together to discuss the paper and then discuss the draft and finalize everything and get that back to the editor in a timely manner is a challenge, but it's always a challenge with reviews.
Yeah, and I don't think that I have had, certainly not with Amalia, but with other students and postdocs that I've done co-review with, I don't think I've had any instances where we had a strong disagreement on the what should happen with a paper, but I can imagine that might in some cases happen. And then the negatives would be that you have this sort of, unless you're doing a co-review with a person who's sort of at your same career stage, you have this power dynamic that would influence that, and I would see that as a negative. But I didn't have that experience. I don't know if you felt that you did. I shouldn't have put the words into your mouth, right?
No, that wasn't my experience either. It helped that, we reviewed papers that I think were mostly focused on ecosystem ecology and trying to understand ecosystem dynamics. And I learned how to do all of that from you. So it makes sense that we would think pretty similarly in our review process as well. But maybe I could see that happening if there was, but even as you mentioned, if there was some kind of disagreement about methods, that would be an area where if I had familiarity, you would defer, to my assessment about it. So that wasn't something we ever faced. But yeah, that would be tricky if it was in fact the case. From a trainee's perspective, it was really, really useful to have a co-reviewer walk me through the process of how the review was going to work and set up a structure for reading the paper, writing the draft of the review, reviewing the draft of the review, and really helping me find the narrative and pulling out that clear information about what do the authors and the editor need to do in order to revise the paper. And I think that especially as an early career scientist, it can be intimidating to read somebody else's work and pass judgment on whether it should be publishable or not. And so going through that process with Nancy really helped me find my voice in that narrative and how to pull out those components in a way that is clear and fair and kind to the authors. And that was really helpful for me.
I would, if I was talking to, a senior scientist who was being asked to, or considering the possibility of doing a co-review, I would say, all the things that I said initially. I mean, I think it will help you because, there may be new perspectives, particularly things like new methods that maybe you are not as versed in that maybe your students are. And, there will be an opportunity to do a much more thorough job than you alone would be able to do. there is an investment. It's not like you can just sort of say, here, do this review, and then, duck out of the picture. So there is a time investment, but I think it's, you're going to benefit by producing collectively a better review than you would have done on your own. And, so I think that speaks, it's also an opportunity. I think it's also our responsibility when we're mentoring graduate students or postdocs or people that we consider as potential co-reviewers, to give them as much of the experience as we can of things that they're going to be encountering later in their career. And a sort of, this is how I do it thing, I mean, it doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but this is how I do it. Now, so you have at least that frame of reference. And, if you want to do your reviewing in your career differently, then fine. But, this is, I think it's our responsibility to give them some experience with that. So that's the other benefit I would see.
One thing I would like to add is that you don't get on the radar of editors as a reviewer until you've published. And so a neat thing about doing co-reviews is that I think it exposed me to doing reviews before I had gone through the peer review process myself with one of my publications, and also gave me an opportunity to get on the radar of the editors for these journals. And so I think it was a really helpful early exposure to the peer review process.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, Amalia did a great job, and so I'm grateful that that I had these talented people available to me to help me do my reviewing responsibilities. That's it. That's all I would add.